Welcome to Fruity Knitting. This is episode 78. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Andrea. And you might be wondering from the title of this episode how Sanquhar gloves, lambing and Japanese knitting all fit together. Well, they don't really, except to show you how incredibly varied our world of knitting is, because that's the common theme. So Sanquhar gloves are beautiful hand-knitted Scottish gloves that date back to the 1800s. And they were used for riding and driving horses, as well as for being worn during the sport of when you're playing the sport of curling on ice. And our feature interview guest, Beth Brown-Renzel, has been fascinated with knitting techniques used in historical European garments during the 19th century. And her focus has been on teaching knitters these techniques. And during the interview, she shows us a collection of traditional garments and mittens that use these techniques, including the Sanquhar gloves. So that's that bit. Now, we're in the month of May, we're at the end of the month of May, and every year, roughly from March to May, so during springtime or whenever springtime is around the world, a whole lot of little lambs are being born all around the world, which is pretty exciting. But this can be a really intense and exhausting time for shepherds, because suddenly they're working day and night to keep their flock healthy and happy. And as the cycle goes on, new fleeces are growing and we get to knit with beautiful woolly yarn. So today we're going to hear from two shepherdesses about what their life is like during lambing season. We think it's a fantastic segment because you will see a little lamb being born and then taking its first drink from mum. It's very, very cute. And while the shepherdesses are talking to us, they have a bottle lamb on their knees. So that's great. Yeah. And we think it's actually a real privilege to see birth. So that's why we wanted to do this segment and share it with you. And it's also interesting to know some of the issues and struggles that shepherdesses face during this time because, like I said, all of this happens before we get the privilege of knitting with beautiful woolen yarn.
Yep. And then we're going to Singapore to meet Bernice, our guest on Knitters of the World, who's been fascinated with Japanese knitting from the age of 6. We've also got 2 completed projects for our Brig and Brag segment, and we've got 2 new projects coming up. So we think it's going to be a great show, and we really hope you enjoy it.
Yeah. So last episode, I just started my Camden hat by the hat designer Woolly Wormhead, and now it's all finished. It's looking great. I'm really super thrilled with it.
Are you though?
Yes. It's a really good design, and I encourage you to knit it if you like it. The yarn I used is the Countess Ablaze Aran weight yarn, and not surprisingly, she's given it a very sexy name. It's called I Want You to Want Me. And it is a very luscious sort of red, orange, brown colourway. So I think it's a cool, cool hat. Now, as I predicted, the hardest bit is the brim. And once you've got over that, the rest of it is really easy peasy to knit. So you do the brim and then you cast on extra stitches for the rim of the hat. And that's all done in a 1x1 twisted rib. You can see there. And that twisted rib also goes over the front of the brim, which I think is really cool. It kind of holds it there and gives it a bit of extra shaping on the slouchy hat. And then when you've done that, it's simply just a reverse stocking stitch body of the hat with 6 twisted knit stitches going up to the crown. And right in the centre of the crown is a little button for true classical cap style. And you do this by knitting a piece of fabric which is sort of in the shape of a diamond, and I used a 2 centimetre button, and then you wrap the material around, sew it on, and then sew it onto the hat itself. And you might notice that I've put the knit side of the fabric on the button to go with the brim, and I think that looks a little bit stylish, a little detail there. It's cool. So last episode, I told you about the saga of trying to find the right stiffening material for the brim and how Andrew went out and got me the right stuff and we inserted and all was good. So I won't repeat that. But there is something I forgot to tell you about that I do want to tell you about. And that is the hardest part is closing the brim. But I finally figured a way of how to do that. So if you can help me by holding it like that.
Yep.
And I'll sort of explain what the problem is, and I'll explain it so it looks good for you, but it'll be a little bit wrong when I show you for me. So So the first thing you do is you do a provisional cast on, you knit the fabric of the brim, you fold it in half and you insert your stiff material. And then you join the two edges of live stitches by knitting them together. So in your left hand you will have, if you can hold it sort of like that, you will have two needles with live stitches on them, and your right hand needle knits one stitch from each needle together, and that's how you go along and you close the top of the brim. But because the brim is really stiff, it's got a stiff fabric there, it forces your needles, all three of them, to lie horizontally like this, and there's no wriggle room. And that's not how we naturally knit. So that makes it extremely hard to do that maneuver. So, because when we knit, we normally just hold our needles at right angles. So I struggled with that until I figured out, okay, what I need to do. In my right hand needle, I use a very long cable, and then I sort of pull it through and I drape it down below, and then I get to hold my right hand needle at right angles. It's still kind of held fairly stiffly, so you only get to knit maybe up to 3 stitches at a time. And then what I have to do is pull my needle through, and I would be pulling these stitches down onto the cable, and then I drape my needle like that again and knit another 3 stitches and then do the same procedure. So you just go along and you close up that seam that way. There's only a set amount of stitches to do, so it won't take you that long, but it is a bit of a struggle. And so if you are going to do it, and if you like it, I thoroughly encourage you to do the pattern. That's how it worked for me.
That's an interesting problem.
It is an interesting problem. You don't realise it until you're there and you're doing it and you figure out, okay. But,
Yeah.
So now I'm going to try it on so you can get to see what this great cap looks like. I think it's a hat that will suit quite a lot of people. I think it suits me.
Yeah,
Do
it
you
totally
like it?
suits you, yeah.
Yeah? You can see, look, there's a little button here and the nice little neat cap brim.
Yeah, I think it's really cute, really groovy.
Yeah.
I sort of also get the impression that it goes really well with your hair, although you did mention that it also looks good on Woolly herself, and
she's only got a coif.
she's got a different hairstyle to you.
So she's shaven off her hair here, and she just has a coif, but she still look really good in it. So that's why I think it'll look good on a lot of people. Yeah. Now, Andrew, I have a question for you. This colourway, this is my I want you to want me hat.
Yeah.
So when I wear it, do you want me?
Do I want you?
Yeah.
I want you all the time.
So I didn't need to knit it.
No, not to make me want you. It should be good for keeping your head warm.
I should have used a different colourway.
I don't know. I wonder what you've got to choose from there.
I know. She's got some good titles there. Okay, so that's the Camden hat.
It's my turn on Bring and Brag, although I have to admit it's a joint project. This is the Tiger design by Martin Story. It's obviously a beautiful sweater for a child. This is actually for our niece, Simba. She's going to be getting this for her 5th birthday, which is coming up very soon. So for me, it was largely a stocking stitch and seaming project, and I actually delegated this beautiful colourwork section to Andrea, which I think was a really good idea now even more than beforehand, knowing what's gone into it. So Andrea will tell you about that in a moment. The yarn here is the Sanquhar Duo, which is a 50% cotton, 50% wool yarn, Norwegian. And I think it's really beautiful. I think it's a beautiful material that we've got, but our niece and your sister live in Byron Bay, which is
quite a hippie area of Australia, and it's a very warm climate, but they do have a small time of winter, and actually Australia is going into winter now, so it'll be perfect for her.
Yeah. I think it's it's a beautiful material. I think it's going to be just right for them in that situation, and Simba's a really fun kid, so I think she's going to really enjoy it.
I hope she likes it.
I'm really pleased to be sending this off to her. So why don't you tell us about this amazing colour work?
Okay, so before I even started the tiger face, one of our viewers, Greta Jensen, who is MA9 on Ravelry, wrote to me to tell me about an alternative technique for stranding floats behind long sections of single colours or a single colour. And I'd seen this technique before, but I didn't know what it was called, and I'd never tried it before, so I was really eager to check it out. And some of you will already know it. It's called the ladder back jacquard technique, and it comes from machine knitting, but it transfers very easily into hand knitting. And so the ladder back jacquard technique allows you to do invisible stranding behind long sections of one colour by using extra hidden stitches. And because the problem is, normally when you're doing stranded knitting and just trapping the floats like you normally do, sometimes the colour of the floats can show through on the front of the fabric, particularly if the main colour is really light like this one and the floats are really dark like the tiger face. So as you know, I really love trying new techniques, so I was really eager to do it. And I actually did a combination of stranded knitting and the ladder back technique, and I think it worked really, really well, because the pattern just said, all the pattern said was to do the tiger face using the technique of intarsia. And when you're working intarsia, you know, for something like this, you'd have a ton of little bobbins, and that's absolutely no fun to work with. You only want to do it if you absolutely have to. And it doesn't always even give a really good result, because if you think of every little bobbin you're using a bobbin for a tiny motif, and always around the edges of that motif you're going to get just a small amount of puckering, just a slight bit of puckering, and then at the end you've got a ton of ends to weave in, and weaving them in, even if you're very careful, will also create a little bit of a distortion on the fabric. So I don't even think it's a good idea to do it that way. So as I said, I used a combination of normal stranded knitting and this ladder back jacquard technique, which I think has worked super well.
Yeah.
If you haven't heard of this technique, I'm sure that you are just dying to go and look it up, especially since I've been waffling on about it. So I've done a short tutorial to show you exactly how easy it is, and that's coming up right now.
Yep. And then straight after that, we're going to meet Kim and Jennifer from Fleece and Harmony Farm, which is on Prince Edward Island in Canada. They're going to tell us about sheep midwifery and bottle lambs, and we're also going to see a little bit of the cycle of life.
Yeah.
We do want to mention, if you're a little bit queasy or a little bit, what do we say? There's about 5 minutes into this section, there is a birth scene, which we think is really wonderful and great to see, but just in case it's not your thing, we thought we would mention
Just shut your eyes for about 1 minute, 5 minutes in, and you'll be right.
Yep.
I'm going to show you how I've combined two colourwork techniques to create this gorgeous tiger face. I've used a combination of stranded knitting and the ladder back jacquard technique, which is a technique taken from machine knitting. So where the two colours are worked really closely together, like on the cheeks here, around the eyes and on the forehead, I've mainly used the stranded knitting and caught the floats on the back of the work in the typical stranded knitting way. And in the areas where there's a long section of only one colour, for example across his nose here or on the upper lip, or in the ears and even across between the ears, I've used the ladder back jacquard technique. So the normal technique of trapping floats can sometimes result in the contrast colour showing through, especially if it's a very dark colour that goes behind a very light colour, as it does in my tiger face. Another really interesting thing to know is stranded knitting creates a less elastic fabric, but the ladder back jacquard technique allows the fabric to be much more elastic. When I turn the work over, you can see that these sections here and there are knitted by catching the floats in the normal way, and these sections, there, and there, use the ladder back technique. And if I take my needle and just slip it behind a ladder back technique, you can see that there's a second layer which looks like a web and is separate from the main fabric. And because it's separate, the fabric is much more elastic. So the ladder back technique basically just creates hidden stitches that won't show on the front, but are there for the sole purpose of catching and holding the float that isn't in use, but still needs to be carried behind the work. I'll show you how to do the ladder back jacquard technique on this piece of knitting here. You can see just below I've done some normal stranded knitting. On the back side you can see some floats. But now I'm going to knit a little white cross here, and then about 18 stitches across I'll do another white cross, and that would mean that normally I'd be carrying my white yarn behind about 18 stitches, or I'd have to weave it in. But with the laddering technique I'll create a hidden stitch about every 5 stitches along. So I've knitted 6 stitches in blue, which is my main colour. And now I'm going to bring the blue yarn around to the front of the work. This is really important. And the next thing I'm going to do is knit into the stitch below the stitch that's on the left-hand needle. And I can either do that by turning my work over and knitting into the purl bump at the back, just like that, with the white yarn. Okay. Or another way is to lift this stitch that's below the stitch on the needle up onto the needle like that, and then knit into it. It gives you the same result both ways. Once I've done that, I then take my main colour and bring it around, and I wrap around that stitch. That stitch is going to be a hidden stitch. And then I just knit a few more stitches. Okay, so now it's time to do it again. I bring the main colour around to the front of the work. I get my contrast colour and I knit into the purl bump of the stitch that's below the stitch on the needle, like that. And I bring my main colour around back to the back of the work, which is going to hide that, and I keep going. These two white stitches here and here are the start of my little white crosses. But these white stitches here are just the hidden stitches that are going to do the laddering stitches at the back. If you have a look at that column there of blue stitches and that column of blue stitches, they're right close up together. So you can see that that stitch will end up being hidden. So now I'm going to show you how to work the following rows with these ladder stitches. So because I'm knitting in the flat, my next row is a purl row. So I purl right up to that extra ladder stitch that I made, and then I bring my main colour yarn underneath the needle and leave it at the back of the work, which is the right side of the fabric. And with the contrast colour, I simply just purl this white stitch. And then I bring my yarn, my main yarn, back under the needle to the front of the work for purling. And that's going to wrap it and keep it hidden. And then I purl along to the next stitch. So you can see it's a very easy procedure. So again, you put the yarn to the back of the work. You take your white yarn and purl that stitch. You bring your main colour yarn back to the front, and then you continue purling. Working those hidden stitches on the knit side of the fabric is pretty much the same procedure. I knit up to the white stitch. There it is there. I put my yarn, my main colour yarn, to the front of the work, and then I knit the white stitch. And then I put my main colour back underneath behind and continue. I've finished my little white crosses. That one's better than this one. I forgot to do 2 extra stitches here, but it doesn't matter. This is just a swatch to show you the procedure. And now I want to finish my colour work, and I want to get rid of these extra hidden stitches. So now that I've finished the cross motif, I'm only working in the blue yarn. So I knit right up to the first hidden stitch here. It's very easy, and I just simply knit it together with the stitch, the blue stitch, to its left, like that. And the blue stitch then becomes in front of the white stitch, and you won't see it. So you just go along the row. Here's the next one. So I'm going to knit the white stitch together with the blue stitch, and it's hidden there, and just keep going. Here's my finished swatch with my 2 crosses, and you can't see any white from those hidden stitches poking through at all. If I turn it round on the back, you can see that's where we created those hidden stitches, and then we worked them here, and that's where we got rid of those stitches. So if I get my needle, you can see if I put my needle through here, it's completely free from the front fabric. And you can see that it looks very different from the stranded knitting below. When we go back to my tiger face again, you can see that I've started and stopped these extra ladder stitches whenever I needed to fill in gaps of long stretches of one colour. So I started some extra ladder stitches here, which is on the back of the upper lip, and I used them until I didn't need them anymore, and then I eliminated them. You can also see here that I changed the ladder stitch from being blue to white. You can also do that. And then when I didn't need them, I eliminated them and continued on with some stranded knitting and carrying the floats. And then again for the nose section, I created new hidden stitches and worked them for as long as I needed them. So there I stopped that one, and this one was longer to here. And then continued on with floats and created some more ladder stitches for this upper area. So you can see this is a really nifty little trick to know about, and you can use it as an alternative when you're doing colour work that involves combination of intarsia and stranded knitting, and it can be used both when you're knitting in the round and knitting flat.
Spaghetti on we go, heel for heel and toe for toe. On and on we go, up from Barry's wedding. Plenty herring, plenty meal, plenty pig to fill her cradle. Plenty bonny bands as well, that's the toast from Barry.
Hi everybody, I'm Kim.
And I'm Jennifer, and this is Roger, our bottle lamb.
Yes, and we're the owners of Fleece and Harmony, a woolen mill in Belfast, Prince Edward Island, Canada. We also obviously have sheep on our farm.
Yep.
And we run the mill and spin yarns made from our own flock sheep and other sheep that live on Prince Edward Island. The main breeds that we spin are Corriedale with Corriedale crosses with Border Leicester. Usually we have a ram that is a Border Leicester, and we also use Canadian Arcot and Rideau Arcot fleeces to make our yarns. So we're here to talk about lambing today, and we'll just give a quick explanation of the lambing process. So we start lambing in April, mid-April. We choose that time on purpose because we want our lambs to be weaned and then out on grass. So because of the weather here in Belfast, in Prince Edward Island, that's about the right time to lamb. And the length of time that you're actually doing the lambing depends on how long you've left the ram in with the flock. Jennifer's in charge of that schedule.
Yeah, so we typically leave our ram in for 2 full cycles. So the sheep, a ewe, does have like a menstrual cycle during which they have days where they are fertile and when they're not. So we just like to make sure that the ram has 2 chances to catch them, so that everybody gets pregnant, so that we get as many lambs as we're expecting.
Yeah. And if you're right on the ball, you take the ram out as soon as you figure that your ewes have been all caught. But this time we left one of our rams in with the flock for a little bit longer than we should have. So right now we're paying the price for that, which is we have 3 ewes that caught late, and we're still doing barn checks every night because we have 3 ewes that haven't had their babies yet.
Yeah. So during the birthing time, when we count the days, and it's about 140 days until the sheep give birth once they've been bred. And so when we're expecting birthing to begin soon or lambing, we set up cameras. We have 4 cameras. We have audio and video going into the house so that we can hear any activity out in the barn that sounds like it might be somebody giving birth. And then we also set alarms so that one of us goes out every 4 hours just to make sure that we haven't missed anything, because some sheep do stay quite quiet when they're giving birth, and others definitely let you know when they want your help. And the time is quite scientifically decided on. It's because if it's cold out, a lamb can probably last about 4 or 5 hours just burning the brown fat inside its internal fat that it's born with, without getting hypothermic and starving to death. But after that, they definitely need an external source of milk. So we want to go out often enough to make sure that if they're needing milk, we get there in time and get them set up with their mom so that they are able to stay alive.
Yeah. And sheep are pretty self-sufficient, so they can have their lambs themselves, but sometimes they do need a little bit of help, and that's mostly if there's multiple lambs in the womb, and they need to be that they sometimes are in the bad position, and then the ewe tries to push out the lamb, but if it doesn't come out easily, then they can get tired, and then they can give up trying to deliver. So usually, if we have to help or there's challenges, those are the kind of things that we're doing. And definitely the size of your hands is what makes you the person that gets to do the helping and what's not. So I have the smallest hands on the farm, so I become the obstetrician of the bunch.
Yeah.
And when we're, if you do need to help a lamb, you don't always know exactly what position they're in. So you do have to do that by touch. So you get pretty used to feeling lambs and trying to make sure that you've, what position the lamb is in. And also if there's multiple lambs in there, that when you're feeling around, that you make sure that you have the legs and body of all of the same lamb, because sometimes they can be on top of each other and you might have the front legs of one lamb ahead of the body of another. So you just have to sort that out. And it really is by touch. You can't see what you're doing. And Jennifer, I heard Jennifer talking to somebody about when I'm helping you, that I actually close my eyes when I'm doing that. And I didn't even know that I did that. And then we noticed that our vet actually does the same thing.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's helpful just to narrow down the stimuli to what you're really trying to focus on. So the eyes being closed really helps. Just with using just the touch sense to figure out what's going on in that little hole that we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. So, and usually it all turns out well. You just give a little, and you don't really, they say pulling lambs, but you're actually not, usually it's not really very, it's not really pulling. The U is still, contracting and so forth, and they come out, they just need like a little bit of help.
A little guidance.
A little guidance, right. So, and then when the lamb is out, we also, if they're tired, if it's been a long birth, then we make sure that we're rubbing them with towels and stuff to help stimulate them. And the moms help with that too. They're licking them quite vigorously to help them to stimulate, to take that first breath and to get used to the outside.
Yeah.
Outside world.
And then we leave the lambs in the pens with the mom for a few days so that they mother up and that they'll bond and they'll understand which lamb is theirs and who they're looking after. And if the mom decides that she's not interested in feeding that lamb, it becomes a rejected lamb. And that's like Roger here. He's a bottle lamb because his mom didn't want to feed him. She got a little bit confused and decided he wasn't hers after all.
Yeah.
And we would never be able to separate a lamb and have it in the shop like this if they were actually mothered up properly, because they would be squawking incessantly for their mom. But as you can see, he's quite used to people because we've been looking after him since he was born.
Yeah.
And when the lambs are bottle lambs, it's a lot of work. So they do need to be fed every 2 to 4 hours for the first few days, just to try to mimic the healthy small meals that they would typically get from their mom. And then as they get on more solid food, which happens quite quickly within the first week, usually we're able to cut those bottle feedings back so that we can get hopefully a little bit more sleep. But it's really important not to overfeed your bottle lambs or they'll get diarrhea, which we call scours, and they can have all kinds of health problems. So it is a little bit trickier.
Because they'll eat.
Yeah,
for as long as you offer them the bottle.
Pretty much. Yeah, they get to be real bottle hogs.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful to watch that you don't spoil them.
Yeah. So that's about it. And Roger, like we said, is 3 weeks old. So we can see he's pretty solid and healthy. So he lives in the barn with the rest of the gang, but he just gets fed by us. And you can see it doesn't have any adverse effect if you're
yeah, he's a good chunk.
Yeah. So, it's a tiring time lambing, but it's also a time of lots of miracles every day in the barn. So
yeah, and we find it keeps other things going on in the world in quite good perspective, because it is a lot of life and death decisions that are being made, and really all you care about at that time is the health of your sheep and the health of the lambs that you're looking after. So it does allow you to zone out on some of the other problems of the world and just really appreciate the privilege of being a shepherd.
Yeah, and no matter how many times you see it, the miracle of birth is really a miracle.
Yeah. It's all really enjoyable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Good boy. Okay.
Nope, not that.
Oh, look. You're the boy.
I'm glad Jennifer mentioned that Roger is not being spoiled, because I have to say I wouldn't have been sure. We saw him about 3 weeks ago and I think he's doubled his body weight in that time, so he's certainly doing very well. I did think Jackie, our dog, if we caught him at a time when he's kind of overdue for a haircut, he'd fit in there just perfectly, both from appearance and also from the behaviour.
Yeah.
Jumping around.
Because he's a poodle and he does look like a little lamb
yeah.
at a certain growth.
I think he'd love it.
Yeah. It is funny seeing this beautiful sort of chunky, healthy lamb sitting on Jennifer's knee and getting all these cuddles and her saying, you can't spoil them. That was hilarious. Yeah. But as Kim and Jennifer said, they spin yarns from their own flock of sheep, but also from the local sheep farmers on Prince Edward Island. And Kim is the spinner, and from talking to Kim, I get the impression she's a real perfectionist, and a lot of care goes into spinning their yarn, which is exactly what you want if you want a good quality yarn. And Jennifer does all the hand dyeing, and they have a ton of colours. They've got very pastel colours and then muted colours, and then completely out there, bright, almost neon colours. And you might remember Andrew knitted the Carbeth for Madeline last year in this stunning bright orange colour, which I completely love. So this is their wool, and it's knitted in the Aran weight yarn, and we were really impressed with this. It's a really great yarn to knit with. It's very soft and very sort of squidgy and bouncy, isn't it?
Yep.
But it's also really hard wearing, because as you know, you've probably seen me, I like to give the yarns my rub test to see if there's any pilling, and there isn't. And Madeline has worn this a lot, and you can see it looks really good. Yep. So that is a personal recommendation, because we've actually used it and done it. And so, yeah, that's super.
Yep. Kim and Jennifer do also have their own Fleece and Harmony podcast on YouTube, where they talk about their farm life and also their own knitting projects. I'm really sure, I think it's entertaining and informative, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers would love it.
Definitely. Fruity Knitting patrons will also be super excited to know that Kim and Jennifer are offering a 15% discount off everything in their online store. And they've recently brought out a great new sock yarn, which is a combination of 80% wool and 20% mohair for extra strength. They've also got lace weight yarns, worsted, Aran and bulky, and all of them are in a ton of colours. So thank you so much to Fleece and Harmony. As we've said during the last couple of episodes, Andrew has finally handed in his notice so that he can join me full-time on the production of Fruity Knitting, which we're both thrilled about. Yeah. Unfortunately, though, he does have to work an extra couple of months to work out his notice, but we had to make this decision, or else I would have to stop the show and Fruity Knitting wouldn't continue. And that's because of the huge amount of work. It was too much work for me to be doing all the time and then him to be doing when he came home from a full-time job. And over, we do get feedback from people that they had no idea of how much work must be going on behind the scenes. And that is a really hard thing for us to give you a clear idea about, without sounding complaining. So I've thought of another sort of an example to perhaps give you an idea. And that is, if you compare when you buy a magazine that might come out every 3 months, so there's 4 issues in a year, and that's been worked on by a team of people. If you compare the content of that magazine with the content of our episode, which we bring out every 2 weeks, and we bring out 24 episodes in a year, then you have to realize how much work must go on behind the scenes. And it's important for us, if we want Fruity Knitting to be stable, especially now that Andrew is joining us full time, that the financial support of the show is spread across more of our regular viewers. So if you are a regular viewer, please, we do need your support. Please become a patron.
Yep. And obviously there's a lot of our viewers who have taken that step and have helped us get this far and helping us keep going into the future. So a really big thank you from both of us to you.
I've started a new garment project, which I'm really happy about because I love garments. It's a really meaty one for me to get my teeth stuck into, and it's going to take me quite a long time because it's knitted on a really fine gauge. The gauge is 32 stitches for 10 centimetres.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is a design called Saint Lunaire Griquet, and it's by Jennifer Beale, who's been on the show twice before in our new releases segment. She always does very complicated, challenging, but exciting designs. So I'm thrilled to be finally doing one of hers. And she comes from Newfoundland in Canada. I know it's meant to be said something like Newfoundland, but that feels so weird for me to say, so I'll just keep saying it wrong, sorry. But Saint Lunaire Griquet is a town in Newfoundland, and so I looked it up, and it's got 640 people there. And every time I see these remote little towns, I think, gosh, I'd like to go and visit it. It would be so much fun.
Yeah.
You'd meet the whole population in an afternoon at the pub. Probably. Maybe. Actually, Andrew had a school friend who lived for a while in Newfoundland, and we'd always planned to go and meet him there, but now he's moved back to Australia.
Yeah. He had icebergs.
Yeah. In the morning, just look out to sea and see icebergs. Yeah. How exotic. Okay. So now, let me tell you about the pattern. Here's a picture of the design. It's worked bottom up with a colourwork circular yoke with lots of textured patterns on the body, and Jennifer used a light coloured speckled yarn for the body and the geometric stranded pattern on the yoke, and a very dark contrasting colour to show off the speckled stranded pattern on the yoke. I don't actually knit with speckled yarns very often, but I really liked the ornate look of this sweater. I liked how it was a really busy result when you use a softly speckled yarn on a textured stitch pattern, and the body has an all-over eyelet basket weave. So I'll talk more about the design when I've actually got some knitting to show you, but the yarn I'm using is Nature's Luxury, and it is on stage long metrage is the blend. It's a blend of, or the base, it's a blend of wool, silk and camel. And the colourway is Legends of the Fall, and I love this colourway. It's just a beautiful, it's a variegated yarn, but all the colours just sort of melt into each other very easily and smoothly. So that's kind of exciting. And I wanted to show you a picture of my knitting so you can see up close. If you look closely at all the stitches on the needles, each one is a slightly different shade. And it has 20% camel, and camel is a beige colour, and when you dye all the different colours over a common background that's beige, it makes the colours more uniform, or they just sort of melt in. They don't have harsh edges between the different colours. And it looks like they're gently melting into one another. I really love it. And then because it's 30% silk, all the little stitches are sort of shiny and they're glimmering on the needles. I think it's extremely pretty. And my contrast colour, surprise, surprise, is this beautiful shade of green here. And you may know the owner of Nature's Luxury. She's Danica, and her husband is a professional horse trainer, and this colourway is called the Horse Whisperer. So he must be the Horse Whisperer.
In his honour.
In his honour,
Yes.
perhaps. Yeah, we don't know. I'm just assuming. So that's the green colour that's going behind this. I've been doing some swatching. As I said, the gauge is 32 stitches for 10 centimetres, and the recommended needle size to start off with is 2.25 millimetres. So I started off doing that down here, and that was actually too tight. I had too many stitches, and so then I went up to 2.5 millimetres. That was still too tight. I had too many stitches, so I went up to 2.75 millimetres, and I got the right gauge here. But then in the eyelet basket weave, I actually need, to get a perfect gauge of 32 stitches, I actually need a needle that's somewhere between 2.5 and 2.75. So what would that be?
2.625, I would say spontaneously. So if anyone has a pair of 2.625 millimetre needles, please send them in.
Chiagoos, preferably.
Don't get picky now. No. Or you could adjust your tension though.
No, I'm not going to
No.
do that. I'm actually going to, I'll talk more about it next time when I'm going to do something, I've got ideas in my head. So I'll tell you about that next time when I've got more knitting to show you. This is what I've done so far. Yeah. It's going to be exciting.
I'm also starting a new project, having finished the tiger, and my project is called the Mura Cowl by Olga Buraya Kefelian.
It sounds about right.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a really simple pattern, which is really good for me because I essentially only knit when I'm brain dead. So the pattern itself is a whole lot of parallelograms, right? So it's just a regular pattern of parallelograms. But the story behind it is really interesting, I think. The name Mura comes from Koryo Mura, who is a Japanese astrophysicist, and he developed this way of folding. Starts off as paper, but it's actually used for folding things like the solar panels for satellites. And they're also talking about using it for flat pack furniture or for something like medical, surgical devices, so stents and things. And the thing is, you can fold it up really compressed and then you can stretch it out into a flat thing really easily. So when they send it up on a satellite, they just need one motor to stretch this thing out into a big panel. So that's a really fascinating story, and it's all part of what they call rigid origami. Anyway, that's the background to the project that I'm doing. That's where I'm up to now, and it's going to be really cool.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bernice. I live in Singapore. The climate here is tropical. It's warm and humid throughout the year. My first experience with yarn happened when I was about 6 years old. I was in my aunt's house when I found a Japanese crochet book, a ball of yarn and a hook. I opened the book and saw photographs of beautiful crochet lace doilies that seemed to match diagrams with symbols in the second half of the book. I was very curious, but I didn't understand the Japanese language, so I studied the diagrams and figured out how each symbol worked. Soon, I was making one doily after another. After I finished using up that ball of yarn, I stopped crochet for a long time. Little did I know that that experience would be the beginning of a lifetime of love for yarns. As a child, I've always loved doing art and creating with my hands. In university, I studied architecture. It opened my eyes to the discipline of design and understand how form, function, construction, and details make good designs. After working as an architect for a few years, I made a switch to teaching art because I actually enjoy working with materials in a more direct way and in a more intimate scale. So I set up an art studio to teach art from home. It was during that time that I started knitting. It is hard to explain my fascination with Japan and the Japanese sense of aesthetics. I guess it all began when I opened that crochet book when I was 6. I've been going to Japan almost every year now. I've also picked up the language because it gives me access to art and design materials in Japanese. I now own many Japanese knitting and crochet books. This vest that I'm wearing now and this crochet pullover are designed by my favorite designer, Michio. The patterns can be found in this book. In just 2 pages, mostly in diagrams and just a few lines in Japanese, knitting instructions for this vest is written. There are no lengthy instructions. This is typical of Japanese knitting and crochet books. This vest, designed by Kaze Kobo, is made with 3 rectangles. After joining parts of the 3 rectangles together, you get a garment. You may be able to tell that some of my designs that I'll be showing later are influenced by the way Japanese knitwears are constructed. The warm and humid climate in Singapore means that most of the projects that I do are summer projects. I love summer yarns. The best summer yarns, in my opinion, are from Japan. I hardly return home from Japan without some summer yarns in my luggage. My first design began with one of such yarns. It is a silk yarn by Hasegawa. I loved the drape of the yarn so much and was inspired to create a design that was in my head. It turned out to be a lightweight top, perfect for layering, with a scoop neck, lace on the back, and straps for fastening at the neck opening. It was well liked by knitters in Instagram where I first showed pictures of the garment. They were interested in the pattern, so I wrote it for 6 sizes and named it Tokonatsu, which in Japanese means everlasting summer. It is not too difficult to find knitting patterns for summer tops in fingering yarns. but even fingering yarn garments can feel too warm for the weather here. Designs for lace yarns are usually shawls or very sheer or lacy garments. I had a hard time looking for patterns for lace yarn garments that do not require an underlayer. Sometimes the weather is so warm that wearing 2 layers can be 1 layer too many. When I was given a beautiful skein of lace yarn by yarn dyer Amelia Putri from Indonesia, I loved it so much that I wanted to use the yarn to create my ideal lace yarn garment, so I designed Batavia. It is knit in one piece from hem to hem, with reverse stockinette on one side, simple lace on the shoulders, with an opening made for the neck, made in the same way as a buttonhole, except this is like a huge buttonhole. The lace continues over the back, followed by textured stockinette stitches. The whole piece is then folded and seamed on both sides. I wear this top a lot because the fabric is light but not too sheer nor lacy. It is good to go on its own. This is a design that I submitted to the Amirisu magazine when there was a call for submissions for the summer 2018 issue. The pictures in the mood board reminded me of photographs that I had taken during a summer vacation in the French countryside, so I developed a design based on memories of the place. It has lace on the shoulders and upper back, and a sea of plain stitches to show off the beautiful drape of the silk yarn by Habu Textiles. Splits are made on both sides for lace inserts in mohair. I love this design because I think it is really feminine and romantic. This is my latest design. I've been looking at various ways of sweater constructions and became interested in satin sleeves and seamed garments for the fit and structure they're said to have. I thought seams would work really well for a very soft and drapey yarn, floating by verb for keeping warm, which I loved so much that I really wanted to have a garment made using the yarn. So with seams and satin sleeves in mind, I created a garment with details that I like. The hem ending just below the waist, fitted sleeves ending at the elbow, and a V-neck that is slightly wide and flattering. There is a lace design on the back, and a delicate cable design that runs from the hem to the heart and frames the neck opening. It was meant to be a one-off piece just for myself because I know that writing instructions for satin sleeves and grading them can be very tedious, and the construction of this design goes against the current trend of top-down seamless construction. I thought knitters were gonna say, "That's very sweet, but I don't like seaming." After showing pictures of the garment online and saying that there was no intention to create a pattern for it, the response that I got was a surprise. Knitters are actually interested to make it. So for them, the pattern was made. The design is called lariat for this part of the sweater that really looks like the long, elegant necklace with a pendant and chains running through it. The pattern is being test knitted at the moment and will be released in early June. I'm happy to share my work with all of you from my little country of everlasting summer. Let's go out and take a look.
We often have viewers asking us for recommendations for warm climate designs, and Bernice has some stunning summer top designs there. So that is really your answer. Keep an eye on Bernice.
Yeah. And actually, I can really understand her fascination for Japanese designs and yarns, because so often when I am looking at just a page of Ravelry designs, a couple will really stand out to me. They're just unusual, or they look like they're sort of cutting edge fashion. And sure enough, they're Japanese. I think there's a real flair there. And I think Bernice has also got a real flair for designing. She's only just starting, but I do think you should keep your eye on her, and see what she brings out. I really like the long tunic with the mohair lace slits.
Yeah.
That's super elegant. You could do that in all different kinds of colours and it would just look beautiful, like just such a great top. And also her latest one with the twisted stitch cable that's sort of in a shape of a necklace with chains coming down. I think that's also really great. So Bernice is offering Fruity Knitting patrons a 25% discount off her self-published patterns, and both the Lariat, which is the design with the look-alike necklace, and Luberon, the design with the mohair side splits, will also have a 25% discount for our patrons when they're released. And they'll be released on the 5th of June into her Ravelry store. So there's not long to wait for those two designs, and then you'll be able to add them to your collection if you love them. So thank you so much to Bernice for your great contribution.
So coming up now, you're going to learn about traditional knitting techniques with Beth Brown-Rensel, who's been teaching workshops on this for years. I know she was at Shetland Wool Week last year, and right now she's actually doing a teaching tour of China, which I'm sure would be a fascinating experience for her in itself. Andrea's already mentioned the Scottish Sanquhar gloves.
Yeah, which I reckon I have to knit. They're really stylish.
Given our Scottish heritage.
Yeah.
She's also going to tell us about, what have we got? The
Collagen
Danish
sweater from Canada.
Okay, and the Danish Netroya.
Yeah.
And we've got the Norwegian Fana cardigan.
There's Selbu mittens she shows. There's Latvian mittens, a couple of other types of mittens. So there's a ton of traditional garments and mittens that she talks about, which is really interesting. And she's also recently written a book all about ganzis called Knitting Ganzis, or Gansey knitting, something like that. But all of this information, she's got quite a lot of information, you'll find on her website, which is Knitting Traditions. And Beth is offering our patrons a 25% discount off her self-published patterns in her Ravelry store, and a 15% discount off her knitting kits at her online store on her website, which includes some of the lovely mittens and gloves, so kits for those that you're going to see very soon. And all the exact details of this you'll find, as usual, on the Patreon site under Patreon specials. Now, because Beth is presently teaching in China and she's just working by herself, she's a one-woman band. If you want to order a non-digital product, order it now, but then just wait, have a little bit of patience for her to get back from her teaching tour and package it up and send it out to you.
Yep.
But now it's time for us to say goodbye and see you again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, so thanks for being with us today. We've enjoyed it. We hope you have too, and we'll see you in the next episode. Alrighty.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome to Fruity Knitting. My guest today is Beth Brown-Rensel from Vermont in the States. Beth is the author of the book Knitting Ganzis. Beth also designs and she really loves to teach. And her main focus has been to educate knitters about historical European knitting techniques. So over the years, she's created many workshops that are based on different traditional garments where you learn all the techniques needed to knit them. So in this interview, Beth is going to introduce us to a variety of these traditional garments and then show us how they're constructed. So welcome, Beth. It's really good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So over the years, you've studied and compared the different European knitting traditions, particularly the ones that developed in the 19th century, and you've also called your website Knitting Traditions. So let's start by you telling us how you first became interested in the topic and what the fascination is for you.
Well, Michael Pearson's book, Traditional Knitting, came out in 1984, and a friend of mine brought a copy over for me to look at. And I immediately fell in love with the Gansey that I saw there and all of the traditional techniques that were used. There were so many variations for like the shoulder joins, the neck bands, and that very intriguing underarm gusset. So that year I started knitting a lot of Ganseys. The next year, Priscilla Gibson Roberts' book, Knitting in the Old Way, was published, and it inspired me to look at other sweaters from a historical context. So I developed my Gansey workshop and then went on to develop one for the Irish Aran and the Scottish Fair Isle jumper. I love teaching knitters, and so I wanted to expand my class offerings. And the next logical step was to look to Scandinavia. So in the 1990s, I traveled to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden to look at several different garments. And I expected to see museum garments that were knitted in the round from the cast on to the shoulder with steeks. And I was so surprised I didn't see any steeks. So one of the curators explained to me that if one cuts one's knitting, the yarn cannot be repurposed for a later garment. So this was a great lesson for me. I realized that I was operating under preconceived notions, and I've tried ever since to have an open mind when I'm researching.
That's a really interesting point. So apparently the garment that we know of today as being the sweater first emerged in the 19th century simultaneously in a few different cultures. So what can you tell us about those very early sweaters? For example, what garment did they evolve from? What countries were first wearing them? Were they a unisex garment, or was it only men? Was it only working class people who were wearing it? What can you tell us?
Well, in most cases, it's considered that the 19th century sweaters evolved from undergarments. And Richard Rutt, in his book, A History of Hand Knitting, writes about the Gansey, that feminine feel for the decoration in dress evolved the fine pattern that became the pride of their menfolk, who, doffing their jackets, exposed the ornamental knitting of the shirt. The underwear then became outerwear. The garments were most likely knitted by women for their menfolk. This is the case with the Gansey. It was knitted for the fishermen as working garments, and the Danish natttrøjer was knitted for women who wore them, and it was based on a beautiful silk, finely knitted undergarment that the elite wore at that time. The Cowichan sweater from Canada, which emerged during the late 1800s, was spun and knitted by the women for the men, women, and children.
And many of the classes that you're teaching are about learning the techniques needed to knit these traditional sweaters that you've just mentioned. And your students learn the special construction features and patterning by knitting a miniature sweater sample. So can you just show us some of those little sweaters and say something about each of their traditions and then talk about their unique construction?
Sure. So the Norwegian fauna cardigan developed in the Bergen area of Norway around the 1850s. It's a blend of two different men's garments, a white garter stitch sweater, a cardigan that was worn for special times, and an everyday striped pullover. The fauna was knitted in very fine yarn, a 2-ply with really small needles at first, and it was knitted with naturally colored yarns from the sheep, but later on more colors were used. By 1930, this garment was standardized and everybody wore it, not just men. And during World War II, the people of Bergen wore this garment as a symbol of solidarity against the Nazi occupation. So in my class, the students knit a solid colored ribbing And then the base of the button bands are put on holders, and the steek stitches are cast on, and then the garment is joined in the round. There are 3 different areas of patterning: the blocks, the dotted bands, and the stars. And there are many historical variations of these motifs. Once the garment is knitted up to the shoulder, all the stitches are put on waist yarn, and the sleeves are knitted from the cuff up to the armhole facing. Then the students baste the armholes and the neckline, and then sew all these areas that are going to be cut on a sewing machine. The button bands are picked up and knitted with attached facings up to the neckband, which is also picked up. And then all of the facings are sewn down to hide the cut edges. The Gansey was developed in Scotland and England, and the first written record of it is 1832. It has an impressive variety of patterning, and they were usually knitted around 7 stitches to the inch or more. The construction is rather sophisticated because of the use of so many gussets, and it was in the round and seamless. So in my Gansey class, they start off with the Channel Island cast on, and then they knit garter stitch welts, 2 of them, flat, back and forth. Then they're overlapped and joined in the round, and the lower body is knitted, including an initial for the intended wearer. The patterning begins, as well as the underarm gussets, and they're shaped with paired increases. When the gussets reach the full width, then the body is split, the gussets are put on holders, and the front and back are knitted flat to the shoulder.
And the gussets are in a diamond shape, aren't they, for the Gansey?
That's right, they are. The first half knitted in the body, the second half knitted in the sleeve. And then the neckband is picked up from live stitches, and 2 little tiny gussets are knitted at each side to make a snug fit. The construction of the Danish natttrøjer is very similar to the Gansey, and natttrøjer means nightshirt. These were worn by women during the night, but they were also worn during the day underneath underclothing, like vests, so that the patterned sleeves would show. And these wool sweaters were knitted at gauges of 8 to 12 stitches per inch, although I suspect they had even higher gauges sometimes. Some of the motifs were enormous, up to 70 stitches wide, so it meant one had to have very accurate knitting so that the purl stitch lines, the diagonal lines, would intersect properly. The natttrøjer is similar to the Gansey in that it has welts and underarm gussets, but these are triangular. They're more like half gussets. Now, in my research, I saw 2 different scenarios for the sleeve and the gusset. One was that the gusset was knitted in the sleeve, and one where the gusset was knitted in the body. The neckline can be left as is, or the student can twine purl around it or crochet around it. But in many of the old garments, the neckline and the cuffs were covered with fabric or ribbons.
Oh, that's very pretty.
In Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, the cowichan sweater was developed in the late 1800s. It was a pullover at first and became a cardigan later on. The women spun the wool from their sheep, and the sweaters have traditionally been natural colors, usually 3 to a sweater. They hand spun the yarns on large spindles, like Navajo spindles, until they figured out that they could convert treadle sewing machines to bulky yarn spinning wheels. They knit English style, and they strand the yarns, weaving them every other stitch, and it creates a very firm fabric. And sometimes intarsia is used as well if there are really large motifs that have long floats between them. The shoulder joints used for these sweaters can hold a lot more weight because the stress is situated over 2 columns of stitches, because these sweaters were quite heavy. The shawl collar is usually made in 3 parts, and the 2 front parts are knitted as they're being picked up, and then the back of the collar is created with short rows, connecting them all together.
Well, that's really interesting. A lot of the techniques are interchangeable between the different cultures, which is it's interesting to hear. Now, you've also got some classes, or you've got one class that you teach called Traditional Beginnings, Cast-Ons from Long Ago, which sounds really intriguing. So could you just show us a couple of those cast-ons and say what they're good for?
Sure. The Channel Island cast-on, which I've used in this sock, probably came from the hand knitting industry, which basically made stockings, but also gloves and caps. And that industry lasted from the 1400s up to the 1800s. So this was in use before the Gansey came along. But it's very decorative, and it's strong because it takes 3 strands to create the cast-on. And I've used it at the beginning of gloves and mittens, at the beginning of hats, on the ends of washcloths, and of course on Ganseys. The knotted cast-on is another Gansey cast-on that is very hard wearing, because when it's made, 2 stitches are occupying the space of 1 stitch. And that means that there's an increased surface area, which helps to resist abrasion. So it's very flexible, as you can see, and it would be great for any edge that's going to take a lot of wear. Essentially, you use long tail cast on and knit 2 and bind 1 off, and knit 2 and bind 1 off. So you can see it gets rather tedious. But the trick of this cast on is to cinch it down fairly firmly so that the little knot will come forward. Otherwise, it's very loose and sloppy looking. The Swedish twined cast on from the Två Anstickening tradition, which is about 400 years old, is a beautiful cast on that works for a lot of different edges, socks and mittens and hats and even garments. And it's made of 3 yarns as well, 1 contrast color and 2 main color yarns coming from 1 ball. The braided cast-on comes from Finland, and I don't know the date of it, but it's a lot of fun to do, and it can be made in 3 or 4 colors. And it also uses long tail cast-on. I'm going to make a slip knot of all 3 yarns and put that on my needle, and then I'm going to work with 2 yarns for the moment, with the 3rd yarn held out of the way. So I create the cast on, and then I'm going to rotate the yarns in a clockwise manner. So that means that the yarn that was just hanging out is now going to be on my thumb. The yarn that was on my thumb will be on my index finger, and the yarn that is on my index finger will be hanging out, waiting for its turn again. So some people get concerned that they're going to get confused, but if you can just remember, the yarn on your index finger is going to make the stitch on the needle. And you can go by the order that's already established of the stitches that are on the needle.
Well, that's such a pretty mitten that you've just shown us there. It looks gorgeous, and you do have quite a few workshops also on traditional mittens. So can you just show us a couple that you've got, just a little selection of different mittens, and again, say something about their patterning and their tradition, a little bit about each of their traditions.
One of the few knitting traditions that can be definitively dated is the Selbu mitten, which was designed in 1856 by a 16-year-old girl for her employer. The Selbu mitten has certain elements that tie all of them together under the heading of Selbu mitten. First, there's the striped ribbing, and then there's a little motif that goes all the way around the mitten before the main patterning begins. So usually there are 2 stars, or roses as the Norwegians call them, and there are seam stitches that go all the way up to the pointed tip, and on the back, small geometric motifs are on the palm. There's a thumb gusset, and the thumb has 2 different types of patterning in it. So there were also other Selbu mittens that were much more intricately patterned, and I find them very challenging to knit because the repeats are pretty much non-existent. Each row is different. The Scottish Sanquhar gloves developed in the lowlands, and it was worn by the common folk and the elite alike from the mid-1800s to around 1920. They're knitted in 2 colors, and they were often named for prominent people in the area, such as Duke, which this pattern is, and also Prince of Wales, and also Rose, which was designed to commemorate Princess Margaret Rose's birth in 1930, Queen Elizabeth's sister. So it starts off with corrugated ribbing, and the cuff has 2 parts. The second part is in sort of a salt and pepper pattern that the date or initials or a word can be knitted into. And then the patterning starts, as well as the thumb gusset, and each column of motifs feeds up into a finger. So this glove has a static architecture, which means if it's just a little small, you can't just add a few extra stitches. You have to change the needle size and the yarn size. In between the fingers, there are little gussets called fourchettes, and the fingers end with 3 triangles.
They look like very smart gloves.
Yes, I love knitting them and wearing them. Latvia is one of the Baltic states, and it has 4 geographic areas, each of which has their own preferences for the colors used, the motifs used, and the patterns in the cuffs. It's not known when Latvian mittens became an important part of Latvian traditional society, but they have a lot of meaning even today, and giving a pair of mittens to someone else implies esteem and friendship. So in traditional Latvian society, young girls started knitting these mittens as soon as they could hold the needles because they needed to fill their dowry chest. It's estimated between 50 and 200 pairs of mittens were needed for the wedding day, which actually the wedding could last 3 to 4 days. And so the mittens were given to the minister, people who brought the food, and even the bride would hang up mittens in her new home to bless it. So there are many wonderful motifs that have been designed, and the cuffs are also always interesting. They're knitted in the round on very fine needles, and there are braids at the beginning, or the picot hem, the diagonal ribbing, the scalloped ribbing, fringe. There are so many colors used in Latvian mittens. You can easily find 3 colors in a round. This one has 4 colors in a round, and I've seen some that have 5 colors in a round, which is a challenge to knit.
Absolutely.
Traditional Latvian mittens had a very high gauge. For instance, a man's mitten might have 100 stitches in it. So very fine needles and very fine single or 2-ply yarns. So modern Latvian mittens aren't knitted as finely, but they're still works of art.
So that was very interesting for me to see an overview of a selection of different traditional mittens and sweaters all at the same time. So thank you so much for showing us your collection and sharing your knowledge with us. I want to finish off the interview now talking about teaching, because you have been teaching and putting on workshops for many, many years. What would you say the biggest challenges and surprises are that your students experience during the workshops, and what do you love most about teaching?
I think one of the biggest surprises my students face is how uncoordinated and awkward they feel when learning a new technique. And that's perfectly natural. I tell them to keep practicing and muscle memory will develop pretty quickly. I love working with knitters, teaching them about knitting traditions. And I feel so gratified when the students are so thrilled with what they've been able to accomplish in class. One of my goals is to tell them about the knitters of the past, whose shoulders we stand on. We're part of a lineage of needleworkers, and I think when one is aware of that connection, knitting has a lot more meaning.
That's definitely true. Yeah, we've got a lot to be thankful for when we look back at what people have discovered and learnt and developed before us, and we're continuing to do that. It's amazing to see how people take right now in this knitting boom, how people take brioche and they combine it with mosaic, or they change things around and develop completely new things. So it's absolutely exciting how that happens. Thank you so much for being with us on Fruity Knitting. We've really enjoyed hearing your knowledge and seeing your beautiful garments and mittens. So we'll say goodbye to the audience now. Bye.
It was good to be here. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.